Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families where we're located on this God's green earth. Welcome to another episode of the Real Talks with Amini. I'm honored to be joined by Andrew J. Walker, a U.S. strategic consultant, emergency responder, and writer who's also an Afghan advocate and played a role in the evacuation of Afghans during the U.S. withdrawal in 2021 and afterwards. Andrew, you have a career that spans over decades of strategic leadership, disaster response, and veteran advocacy. So first, welcome on the show. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. Maybe we can start by if you can describe how did you get involved with the Afghan evacuations and what motivated you to take part in that process?
Hi, Sadiq. Thank you for having me very much. I appreciate the time. Uh, Personally, my involvement started with an article I wanted to write about the movie Retrograde. And I met with General Sami Sadat after I had reviewed the movie and screened the film. I thought it was a really prescient film about, some of the things we were confronting as we withdrew from Afghanistan. So I met Sammy, and that was the beginning of my involvement. I met Sammy Sadat. I met Scott Mann. Attended Scott's play, and I was eventually contacted. I started to be contacted by Afghans to support them, to help them get out of Afghanistan. So I ended up going to Washington, D.C., meeting directly with some of the people that arranged the testimony for Congress for Scott Mann and some of the other people. And I ended up becoming part of that Task Force Argo. So that was how I got involved.
Mhm. And what role and contribution did you have for the evacuation process?
For me, I was an Afghan evac handler, so I was helping with the case file and then the task associated with the case file of some of the commandos that were trying to escape the Taliban oppression in Afghanistan. That was the area of my focus was support of the commandos and the special tactical units because I felt like those units had the most important contribution in terms of our war fighting. They were the highest and most at risk, in my opinion. Besides the translators, I think the cultural interpreters, translators, and combat soldiers were the highest value targets for the Taliban. So that's where I focused my efforts. And that's what I did. I tried my best to do what I could. I'm not a veteran, so I don't have the voice of a veteran. I had to use my voice as a citizen journalist and as a writer to talk about this subject from the standpoint of an American citizen. And I think the reason I was successful was soldiers recognized that I cared about them and about what their disposition after their service. And because of my kind of contribution to their work, they helped me network through the military and very successfully, get to meet people. And I was very lucky to, meet people that in my life were my heroes. As I grew up, a lot of these men I have met and talked to some of the men that have helped me actually, with this task. And
Can you tell us one of the most difficult moments during the time when you were helping with the evacuation process?
I can remember a time we were extracting a commando, and we had been very strict with him and told him the order of operations that were going to take place. And we had said to him, if this happens and this happens, then this is going to happen. And when this happens, you do this. So just out of sheer bad luck, we didn't do what we were supposed to do. So he refused to be picked up by his contact that was going to help him. And I can remember him calling me saying, I didn't pick up the phone because they didn't say a certain, they didn't, give me an indication who they were. So I hung up. So I remember my wife at that time was really at her wit's end because I had really run myself ragged doing this. And she said, look, you can't keep sending, financial aid to these guys. We have needs here. And, I was taking off work to do this. So I was consulting while I did this instead of my career job. And, so it was financially a strain. And I can remember thinking, I need to wire money for his family to get where they need to go. And my wife had just said to me, whatever you do, don't send any more money to your friends in Afghanistan. And I immediately sent that money to him that evening. And then the next morning, the Taliban were in his home. I can remember that gentleman, in sending that money, we had saved his life. And I can remember the events that led up to that moment. One of the culminating events was the Taliban had broken into his son's school, a very small boy, and they dragged him out into the street and beat him, interrogating him to try to get the whereabouts of his father, this elite soldier. And that was one of the culminating events. And then right after that, a man was murdered with his adult sons. And I can remember I was up night after night trying my best to get this guy to safety, and we finally did get him to safety. And I can remember we needed to do a lot of different things. I don't want to go into the specifics, but at one point I was so desperate to help him. I knew that there was going to be fundraisers that would be at Scott Mann's closing of his show, Last Out. So I drove to Tennessee in a weekend, 1,800 miles. And that weekend, I had been up almost for 3 nights. I had about three hours sleep in 3 nights, talking to different people and rushing around, trying to do different things. And I drove to Tennessee with 3 hours sleep in about 3 days in a weekend to try to get it made. I think that was the hardest week I ever had. Uh, because at the end of the day, his wife and his 8 children and him, they all were relying on us to find a solution where there was no solution. And I think the hardest part of it was to recognize that you weren't going to have solutions. You weren't going to always have the answer. You weren't going to always be able to succeed in this. And some of the people you tried to help would be murdered and were murdered. I think they were the hardest moments.
I can imagine.
Members of our task force were murdered, and having this, seeing this man's son beaten by grown men. I can't tell you how hard some of these things were, but I always thought to myself, if I give up, where will he be? Where will his children be? And when we talk here about human trafficking, we don't think about the fact that if we allow this person to be murdered, what will happen to his wife? What will happen to his daughters? Will they be trafficked? Will they be sold into human slavery? Will they be married to a member of the Taliban because their father isn't there to protect their interests in life? So I can remember my friend saying to me, my brother, if I am killed, my family will be lost. They'll be in the wind. Please help me. And that was 3 years ago. And, eventually I had to step down from the task force. I couldn't stay with it because I couldn't do it anymore. Emotionally, it just took such a great toll on me that I had to step aside from a lot of my duties officially. And now I do it. I still do it, but I do it unofficially.
Yep. I can imagine. I mean, thank you for everything that you have done for those families. But in retrospect, if you look back, how do you see the role of the private sector, people like you and veteran networks stepping in and trying to help beside the U.S. government that was the primary institution in charge of the evacuation? What role did private citizens and veterans play?
Oh, I mean, the role there's so many different things that private citizens did, especially veterans. Most of the people in the task forces were veterans. A lot of the people in the task forces were elite soldiers, special forces, and different kinds of special forces soldiers, Joint Strategic Air Command guys, Rangers, different elite soldiers. And the role they played was invaluable. I mean, they extracted people from Afghanistan. They saved people from prosecution. They kept people in safe houses. They opened safe houses. They maintained safe houses. I mean, the task forces sent in food, sent in humanitarian aid, medicine. There are so many different things these task forces did. You know, it's hard to even put a finger on what the task forces do because so many do so many different things that I'll suffice it to say is they filled a vital role that was needed at the time. They met the moment and they were needed. And I think in this fact that we had surrendered at Doha and we had, I don't know if you want to call it, they may call it something else. I mean, I'm a citizen. I mean, essentially it's an agreement to leave, so it's a surrender agreement. When we surrendered at Doha, we had specific terms that we laid down, and I think that um, when things went bad and it was indicated that things were going to continue to go bad, there was very little that you could do if unless you didn't withdraw. So I think the moment was met with the need for these task forces, and I think some did a better job than others. I think some were better at it than others. It's a very complex thing, and I think that going forward, I think one of the things we need to do is we need to recognize who was good at this and why they were good at this. And we need to evaluate if we ever do anything like this again, who we're going to empower with a task force and who we're going to cooperate with, because it's more important to be effective and efficient than it is to be diplomatic and gregarious to people who did a great job. I mean, we need to reward good work and we need to reward effectiveness. And I think going forward, as these things happen in the world, I think that you're going to see more and more task forces will form. But I think the government has to recognize that it needs to take the leading role in a task force and what the task list is for that task force to do and the authorities that they have to do it with. We need to cooperate. You know, we
Sure.
need to cooperate as a government with the task forces if we're going to give them tasks like this to accomplish.
Of course. And in retrospect, how do you evaluate the US government doing the evacuation? How did they do a good job? What were some of the areas in your view that they could have done better?
Now, I'll say this. Um, there were probably security reasons why we sent people out of one airport and material out of another airport. And I think there was widespread criticism that we didn't use Bagram. We used HKIA, but when you look at the pictures of the evacuation at HKIA, you can see the size and scope of HKIA as an airport. It's a very large airport, and you have the ability to bring plane after plane after plane onto the tarmac and line things up. So, I think that the error they made was allowing the Taliban to maintain arms while we evacuated, allowing them freedom of movement, while we evacuated, allowing them to maintain, armed positions and to we gave the government that we had formed and we had cooperated with for 20 years, these terms of engagement that were so hard for them. I mean, they basically had to wait until they were being shot at to shoot back. They didn't have, it was just I think the Doha Agreement made the Afghan government really put them at a disadvantage. And I think the way that Biden took care of the evacuation, he moved a lot of people at first, but because the Doha Agreement allowed this freedom of movement of the Taliban, and he didn't cancel the agreement, he allowed the Taliban to travel right directly up to where we were. And, this was the security breach that blew up, at Abbey Gate. And, I mean, there were so many mistakes made. It's hard for me to say this is the one thing that I would say is the central mistake made. But I think if I had to put my finger on one thing that was wrong with the withdrawal, I would blame Biden and Trump. Biden didn't execute the withdrawal up until the end as he should have. And Trump's terms, I didn't believe were strong enough in terms of our ability to operate in the country and to leave peacefully. We allowed them to get too close to us with their arms. So,
And that
I
caused
don't have very many. I don't have very many good things to say about anybody in the government. I think we made a lot of mistakes. We were very good intentioned. We spent a lot of money. I mean, trillions of dollars in 20 years were spent, and we did a lot of good things. We educated women and girls. We created, order, and we created an army and a functioning government, but we made a lot of mistakes along the way too. So did the Afghans. So
yeah.
for me, I try not to concentrate on what went wrong. I try to concentrate on what we can do right next time,
Yep.
or what we can do effectively to resolve this situation now.
Absolutely. And we'll get in a second into what can be done for Afghans and Afghanistan in the future and right now as well. So you write about the moral injury, and what do you mean by that? And how do you think the withdrawal and the way the mission ended in Afghanistan has affected Americans and veterans in terms of their morale and the way their lives worked, basically. More than 20 years, people invested, their sons and daughters went there. Some of them lost their lives, some of them got wounded, all for nothing. We're seeing Taliban coming back and taking over. How do you think the impact of this was on Americans and for you personally, I'm sure?
I can tell you, I personally didn't understand moral injury for a long time. In fact, I would get angry when I would hear somebody say, I'm suffering from moral injury. I would think, my guy is going to be skinned alive, or drowned with his hands tied behind his back. That's the injury my guy is going to suffer in Afghanistan. So when somebody would say, I'm working through this moral injury, at first I would get a kind of like, I don't want to say angry so much as, you know, disillusioned. Like, what do you mean you're suffering from an injury when other people are being physically injured and harmed? But when it came time to try to move this guy, to try to use mechanisms of action of the government couldn't do it or wouldn't do it. And I kept on running into a brick, wall after brick wall. That was when I really felt the moral injury. That was when I understood it finally. That was when I really recognized, something is happening. It's morally wrong. I know it's morally wrong. It's happening and I can't stop it from happening. And that's for me, that was the moral injury. It was like something I know could be stopped is not being stopped. Something I know that could be, suffering I know could be alleviated is not being alleviated and is not going to be alleviated and eventually will end badly. I think soldiers have suffered tremendously after the global war on terror. A moral injury so severe that I think a lot of people became very disillusioned. And I think, if you harm the desire of a soldier to fight for his own country because you've done something morally, that is, doesn't jive with his core values, you run the risk of having people not enlist in the military. We could become a country like some South American countries where there's militias and different private contractors, and you're seeing that more and more. You're seeing the role of private contractors, private military contractors, or military contracting companies take more and more and more of a leadership role in these things, and I think it's not the way that we're made, as a nation. It's something we need to deal with because these injuries, they come with a big price tag. I mean, for me, I suffer from PTSD because there was a murder in my family many years ago, and it took a long time to manifest itself in my life, more than 15 years before I started to really suffer from PTSD. So I think, I'm one of these kind of rare cases of people. I have had physical injuries and moral injury, a lot like a lot of soldiers I know. I relate to soldiers on a lot of different levels. My father was a combat veteran, so, I think it's going to have a very long-standing effect. The collapse after the war, and the knowledge, certain knowledge that so many people died. Many of your friends may have died in these wars, and when in the end we just surrendered and left, and there's no explanation of why we fought or what it was all for, it's going to leave a soldier feeling cheated. I think that's the essence of moral injury is the effort that I made was based on what you told me, to be patriotic, to support the country, to take up arms and to, protect my family from tyranny and terrorism. And when all of those things are taken away and somebody says, I'm going to just tuck my ball under my arm and go home, I'm going to end the game by taking the ball away, like we did. Essentially, we basically, it was a retrograde withdrawal. We surrendered and left. It's going to be many years before soldiers are recovered from this moral injury, and I think it's really important for the government to recognize that there's going to be people suffering, people who fought for this country, and we need to do things to support them
Absolutely.
until they don't need support anymore.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's really hard to see America being in the grip of having the power and having the necessary mechanisms and resources to get this through, and then all of a sudden leaving everything behind was really unbelievable. I could say, and I can imagine how everyone would feel who were actually invested with everything that they had got in their lives. So looking at back right now, looking at the Taliban 2.0, the version that was sold to Americans and the international community, the Taliban have changed. That is a different Taliban, that they no longer have ties with Al Qaeda, their views on women have changed, that their animosity towards the U.S. has changed, and some are still, I think, are advocating this. What do you see? Is the Taliban changed? Or is the Taliban 2.0 the same as the Taliban 1.0, where the Al Qaeda is still with them, the ISIS-K is with them, all of these terrorist groups, and they publicly and loudly indicate their animosity towards U.S. and Americans. They held Americans hostage. They tried to forcefully convert them. Fortunately, he got released before he break down under those tortures. What do you see? I mean, all of those ruthless ways that they're dealing with women, with Afghans, with veterans, with soldiers. They continuously kill Afghan soldiers and commandos wherever they get them. What do you see, and what do you have to tell to the American public about the Taliban 2.0?
I can tell you the Taliban is an extremely violent group. They have murdered whole families, including infants, to punish elite soldiers for not being caught. They have drowned. And I can tell you this, not on conjecture. I can tell you this from my personal experience. I personally turned in war crimes to the International Criminal Court at The Hague. I can tell you that the Taliban is absolutely a terrorist organization that is cruel, and the punishment that they enact on people that they want to affect revenge on from the war is very real. More than 800 people have been murdered. Soldiers are still being murdered. When people are sent out of the neighboring countries and they are deported back to Afghanistan, the soldiers and the people that are in that database of the Taliban, of the former army, are culled out of those groups and they're put in jail and interrogated. Oftentimes they're tortured, many times they're murdered. So the Taliban, whether or not they tell you they've changed, they haven't changed. And the fact of the matter is, their killings have been reduced over time, but I don't think their number of killings has gone down, not because the Taliban has decided to kill less people. It's because more of the people have evacuated to other countries for safety. So as these other countries deport, like Pakistan, Iran, all the neighboring countries are being very hard on Afghan refugees because it's putting a strain on their country's social service, their social service, net. So the fact that this is the fact that people in America need to understand: as these people are being sent to Afghanistan, many of them are being murdered or tortured or jailed without charges, without cause. So if we send back Afghans from America to Afghanistan, if we cancel their status here and we don't allow them to stay, we have to recognize that we may be sending them back to their executioner, and we may be participating in the kill chain of our own allies, our own former allies. And I think it's really important to frame it in that way, that we are effectively making a decision, and that decision is sending people that were soldiers who fought for counterterrorism and fought the global war on terror, sending them back to our sworn enemy, a vicious killer that is a terrorist organization supporting a variety of other terrorist organizations. And, whether they say they don't support Al Qaeda or not, the fact remains, AQIS and all of these so many different terrorist organizations, because of the lack of governmental organization in Afghanistan. It's a safe haven for terrorists right now, and it's a safe haven for China and Russia to affect change in the region, in the Middle East. So we need to start to retool and re-gear our efforts towards creating a safety net for these folks who can come here on their own volition and on their own finances. Because some of the people who get granted visas are going to have enough money to come over here. We need to start to make these task forces effective at supporting people without any support from the government. And I think we need to start to consolidate some of these task forces together, and the people that are willing to keep doing this work, into more powerful agencies that are working interagency kind of task force, interagency support. I think that's the answer going forward. Is we need to do two things. We need to force the Taliban to stop extra legal killings, to murdering people. And we need to do that with the leverage of our aid. And the other thing we need to do is, the people that do come over to America, do come over here, we need to see that they're safe. I mean, some of these people are being murdered while they're in America after they lived through 20 years of fighting and 3 years on the run. They come over to America. Several people have been murdered in America. So we need to recognize, and I think I was lucky when I grew up. I grew up in a very small mill town, a little factory town. And it had a bunch of little factories in it. And about half the people in the school I went, it was a little religious school, so about half the people in this school, their dads worked in factories. And they were construction workers and factory workers. And half the kids in the school were like me. my dad worked in the defense industry. So my dad was a combat veteran, worked in the defense industry, but I lived in and was associated with my whole life at-risk immigrant populations, English as a second language. So I have a natural affinity for people who are trying to get ahead in this world from other countries. And, because of the kind of school I went to, we talked about this all the time. America is a melting pot. The magic of America is the fact that we are a melting pot. We are a melting pot of all different races, all different creeds, all different religions. We're organized under this secular democratic government. And the beauty of America, the real beauty of it is we can have a government by and for the people, regardless of your religious affiliation, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of what you think or feel or say or do. As long as you follow the rules, you can have a wonderful life in America. And I think that's why I identify so much with Afghans, because I recognize them as almost like my friends that were Portuguese growing up, coming over to America, learning the language from their family. And I can remember sitting next to Portuguese children, and my friend Vic Fernandez would be sitting here next to me, and his cousin, who just came over from Portugal, would be sitting next to him. And the teacher would say, "This is a predicate." And he would say in Portuguese, "This is a predicate," And then they would say, "This is a noun," or "This is whatever." And it was magical, to see these kids in 6 months. They went from not being able to speak a word of English to speaking English, to joking, to playing, and to going on to become fully, full citizens of America and to have jobs. And, like for me, I think it's really, really important to maintain what's great about America. I recognize there's a lot of talk about the border and there's a lot of talk about border security, and that's very important.
Mhm.
Security is very important. You can't have a secure country without a secure border, and I recognize that border security is very important, but I just urge people, like, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to throw away everything in America that makes America the great place it is for security.
Yeah.
Because if we do that, we've lost the whole reason for having this place in the first place.
Mhm.
If you're coming into America and you can't be assured that you have the five protections of civil liberties, well, why would you come here?
Yep.
Why would you come here?
Yep.
So we need to make sure that all the great things about America, and there are many great things about America, despite any mistakes we may have made, despite missteps we may make sometimes, by and large, the United States of America is a global superpower and a power for good in the world.
Yep.
We've done a lot of very good things.
Yep.
So,
So right now, the U.S. government has paused the evacuation of
yeah,
Afghans
yeah, yeah.
at risk in Afghanistan, and they're reviewing some of the departments involved in that process. They're saying a special immigrant visa is continuing, but we're not sure how they're continuing, whether it's still ongoing,
Right,
it
right.
will continue.
Okay.
What do you think the new administration's priorities should be in terms of evacuating their allies? Do the U.S. government owes their Afghan allies safety and for them to be evacuated?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, right? We're the United States of America, and we made a contract. We made a contract with Afghan soldiers, with Afghan interpreters, with Afghan politicians. And the contract stated if you work for America for a year, at least for a prime contractor, you are entitled to a visa. And if you can pass your Department of Defense, Department of State, and all the reviews that are coming between you and that visa, you deserve that visa, you get that visa, you earned the visa. And so we're not giving anything to anyone. We're granting a visa to someone who lived up to our contract terms. So I think it's very important to recognize that we, the United States of America, made a contract with Afghanistan soldiers and people. We, the United States of America, said we would do X, Y, and Z provided you do these things. So far as I'm concerned, this is what the government of America needs to do. If they have decided they're going to cut programs and they're going to cut this program down, there's going to be a lot less people that come here. But it's my opinion that if you lived up to the terms of the contract, you earned that visa, you should be granted that visa. And you should be granted that visa in a timely way. If we moved 250,000 people in 2 weeks, why the hell did we, why the hell are we moving 10 or 11,000 people a year for 3 years?
Mhm.
Right? You have like an organization like No One Left Behind, which I think is one of the preeminent organizations in aid. I think one of the most excellent organizations in terms of their corporate governance and their ability to get the mission done. You get a group like that, they're one of the most successful people, and they're moving through numbers. So I think we need to, as a government, we need to say, what are best practices? Who are the best at doing this job? What is it that what we're trying to do? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And if the thing that we're trying to accomplish is to get this paperwork done, we need to fortify the ability of the State Department and the Department of Defense to do this work by developing the people that do this work. And we need more people to do this work every day as their career and get through this caseload. Because 3 years later, we shouldn't be, meandering through a few thousand of these things a month. I mean, we're the United States of America.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
we are the United States of America. We are the global superpower that runs the world. If you're telling me that we're not capable of doing paperwork in 3 years that we did in 2 weeks, we moved 250,000 people in 2 weeks, but we're not capable of doing it anymore. I don't believe that. It's not that we lack the capability.
Yes.
It's that we lack the will. And it might not even be lacking the will. We lack the ability to leverage the American people's desire for this to happen.
Beside evacuating allies, it's been more than almost 4 years now since the Taliban have recaptured, and the situation is really tragic for Afghans and the threats that are being cooked up there against the U.S., against the West. What do you think the U.S. administration, the U.S. government could do to help the anti-Taliban Afghans? There's one thing to evacuate as many Afghans as we can from Afghanistan, but also we need to make sure Afghanistan is safe for the remaining population, for women of Afghanistan, for children of Afghanistan. So, what do you think the U.S. could do to help other Afghans who are trying to free their country from the Taliban?
I think the U.S. needs to support the mission of the UN and other people that are holding the Taliban to account. The International Criminal Court at The Hague prosecuted the Taliban for war crimes. We need to do more of that. We need to make them recognize if they take the risk of an extralegal killing for revenge, there's a possibility they're going to be put in prison themselves. Like, people need to recognize there needs to be at least enough rule of law in Afghanistan for them to recognize the potential damage to their lives they could cause by a revenge killing. There has to be severe consequences. And I think, to your point, we are not going to be able to evacuate all these people because we're ending the program that would support them. So I would say the majority of people in Afghanistan are not wealthy enough to fly their whole families over to America and then live here while they learn the language, and while they learn to read and write American English. It's going to be a hell of a hard thing for a person to fly themselves over to America, find a place to rent a home, stay there, learn the language, get a job. I mean, without a significant amount of aid, these people are not going to be able to do that. So I think realistically speaking, there's going to be a lot less people that get granted visas than thought maybe initially that they were going to. And I think of the people that get granted visas, a lot of these people are not going to be able to afford the cost. So I think we need to do two things. We need to make Afghanistan safer by leveraging the Taliban with the aid we give them, and by forcing consequences on, I can't tell you the number of terrible videos I've seen. The Taliban loves to make videos of themselves torturing and doing a variety of different criminal activity. And they send these videos directly to the families of the people that they do this to. So I can't tell you the number of videos I've seen, and anything I saw was significant, I would send to The Hague because I want these people to be executed for it. You
It's
know,
almost
you want to
four
tie a
years
man's.
now. But it's almost 4 years now that we haven't been able to make any breakthrough in terms of leverage. And in the previous regime indicated for 6 years they were in charge. We couldn't do anything about it. So maybe
Yeah.
it's time for the US to start leveraging anti-Taliban Afghans, those who actually have the willingness and the resources and the popularity among Afghans to take on the Taliban, to free the country from this terrorist regime.
Well, I'll tell you, I've had a change of heart about this very recently. For years, people would came to me and said, "Hey, support the resistance." And I have one answer, up until now. I said, when the government supports the resistance, I'll support the resistance. But I'm not going to tell my friends in Afghanistan, stop this diplomatic track you're on, go underground and start to fight the Taliban. If I don't have some level of command and control in the battlefield, if I don't have some level of cooperation with information and targeting, I don't have, these guys don't have weapons, information, intelligence, targeting, or financial support. I won't support anybody who's fighting because they're going to be killed. They're going to be cannon fodder. But to your point, if they're not going to come back over to America, if they're going to send these people to Afghanistan, and we can't give them some level of measure of safety and security, then I say, let's support the resistance. Let's resist. Let's support an armed resistance and a militia, because at least then they'll have a fighting chance. But we have to decide what we're doing. At the end of the day, we have to decide what we are doing. And I think there's too many competing interests that are trying to do too many different things. And if we don't get more honest about what it is that we can do and how it is we can do it, we're not going to get that accomplished. And a lot more people are going to suffer.
Right.
So
And the new
that's
administration, it seems, are intent to take back Bagram, not for the sake of Afghanistan, as the president said, but because of China. So, envisioning a time when the U.S. troops would be back in Bagram and taking back, it would make logical sense for American troops to have their own counterterrorism reliable allies on the ground, having arms and weapons and ammunition, not the Taliban, who at any moment could turn their guns and all of these heavy weaponry that they have towards American, whether they're soldiers or diplomats, and there's no guarantee.
yeah.
We saw how Iranians took hostage of American diplomats when they took over Tehran in the 1979. So that's why I think that was the fear, and all of the diplomats evacuated when the Taliban took charge of Afghanistan. So we can't put our people at risk of sending them among Taliban where there's no guarantee that, at some point they would be taken hostage or be killed. So we need to change the regime. We need to and help the other Afghans, anti-Taliban Afghans, to take over the country for them to go back and be safe in Bagram and to do whatever they want to do with China. Do you think the administration is looking at those possibilities, or they should look into those possibilities?
I think they should. I think they are. I mean, it was reported, and I'm not saying anything out of school here. It's been reported that we landed at, one of our planes at Bagram, and we have intentions to take back Bagram and to take back some of the equipment that we left behind. I think it's important. I think we should be there. I think we need to be there in that military base. I think we should say to the Taliban, we're going to be a permanent presence in this country. If you want financial aid from America, to help you with agriculture and education and public works projects and all these different things that we do. I mean, the list is long from cigar. I mean, we do a lot of different things to keep the government from
Clearly,
collapsing.
Andrew, Taliban do not want American troops back in Afghanistan. They fought for 20 years against the
Yep.
US and NATO forces, so they don't want any US troops, and there will not be any way that you could agree with the Taliban for them to allow you to be
No.
on the ground. That's not possible. So, what is the alternative?
I I think the alternative is to say this is the drop dead arrangement that you have now. We are going to go back and occupy this space, and we're going to continue to support your counterterrorism, goals, and we're going to continue a number of these programs that will help your country reestablish itself financially and economically, so that you can function and your currency doesn't collapse and your economy doesn't collapse. I think they should say to them, we're going to stop everything. Just like you did this 90-day pause in America, they need to do a 90-day pause in Afghanistan and say, okay, day one, you're not going to get any more of this aid. And then all of this aid starts to evaporate. And, obviously the Taliban, there's corruption. There's probably some of this aid, of course, is being, siphoned away. But, in my view, that's all the more reason why you need to hold that aid out as leverage, because they need the aid and they want the aid, and they will do something to keep that aid.
I
You
respectfully
know,
disagree with you on that, Andrew. I don't think they care about the aid. I mean, they fought for 20 years against the US and NATO forces. They're fundamentally anti all of the religions of the world and their extremist version that they have. They will never tolerate other people with guns. They don't tolerate Afghan Muslim moderates having guns and being part of the government. They do not tolerate women to be part of the government. How do you think they will tolerate American troops being on the ground in Bagram and they would be in charge? I mean, that's not possible. There's no way that that would happen. Do you think there's a way for the US government to understand this truth that there's no way that you can reach any agreement with the Taliban, that this group is a terrorist group, they're your sworn enemies, they're in bed with Chinese, they're in bed with Russians, they're in bed with Iranians, and they're in bed with elements of Pakistan, and they worked together for 20 years to kill American soldiers, American generals, and NATO soldiers, NATO generals, and Afghans to get rid of you, to force you to leave Afghanistan. And they did achieve that objective. And so they will never let you be back for as long as they're in charge. Does the US government understand this? And is it possible for them to find an alternative way to make sure support your own allies, your own counterterrorism partners, so they can go back and get rid of the Taliban so that that way you will be back in Afghanistan. That is the logical way for you to be back because you want the people who are pro US Western presence in Afghanistan in charge and those who can protect you and guard you, not the terrorists who are seeking any opportunity to take you hostage or to kill you.
well, we fought for 20 years, 2 decades with the Army, the full Army, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines. We were all there for 2 decades, and we didn't win that fight. I think the first thing you say is, these are all the areas of aid you get. All of these areas are going to be paused, and we're going to reevaluate giving you anything tomorrow unless we start to see certain changes made. At the end of the day, even if you fight the Taliban, you're going to be there for years fighting. You're not going to displace the Taliban with a militia group or with a resistance group overnight. You'll be there for years fighting. So I have mixed feelings about it. It's like, my opinion is, you need to do everything you possibly can do to say all of the areas of support are subject to change. All the areas of support can go away tomorrow unless you have some modicum of safety for your people. If we are unwilling to do that, if we're unwilling to see it through in terms of the humanitarian aid, yeah, I agree with you. We should support the resistance. I mean, support the resistance like we supported the Northern Alliance. We can't support the resistance in the sense that we say, oh, we're going to build a school next to this other school. We're going to cut down this poppy field, with scythes. And then the next time the poppies grow, they just grow back from the bulbs again, and they're there the next harvest. And we need to do things that are more enduring. And I think going to Bagram would be a good first step. It's a very secure air base. If we're there, we could, fortify that base well and keep it safe for our people inside that base, and we would have some ability of control. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of rules of war, and even if we were in Bagram, we can't just milly-nilly just fly a plane anywhere we want and blow things up. We have there's international rules that apply. It's I don't under there's no way I can see clearly to do one or the other of those two things that we both want to do, right? The one thing is, if you're going to keep the people in Afghanistan, a lot of people aren't going to be able to come because they don't have the financial resources. You need to work somehow in a diplomatic track with the existing people that control that government, and say, how do we stop this thing, this mechanism from happening, where your people are killing these people in revenge killings. And my perspective is, we haven't done enough to leverage the Taliban, because we are giving them millions and millions of dollars in aid.
So
you
what do you
know
think?
and
What do you think? What would it take for America to realize that the Taliban, as a terrorist organization that it is, as an entity that is an ally of Al Qaeda, that is working closely with ISIS-K, that is in bed with Chinese, with Russians and Iranians and Pakistanis, they're a proxy group of your enemies, that
yeah,
they will never be, you will never reach any understanding with them. You
no,
tried that and failed for years and years. There's no way, there's no breakthrough, there's no possible way for you to reach an agreement. It is, from their perspective, it's a zero-sum game. Whether if America is strong and powerful, they will make sure that they will work with their brothers in arms, all of the terrorists worldwide, to take on the US and Western world and bring them down. That is their
yeah.
intention. And so we had it previously for 6 years, it was tolerated, and then we saw what happened in America 9/11. Do you think America and
Yeah,
Americans waiting for another 9/11 for them to go back and get rid of this regime?
I think the fear now, because of a lot of misinformation about the program, the refugee program from Afghanistan. I think the fear now, there's a lot of fear mongering that the people we allowed in, our allies, are really, wolves in sheep's clothing. I think there's a lot of false narratives out there that we weren't careful about who we allowed into the country. And, I think in the initial collapse, I think they named about 40 cases of people they felt that they didn't vet properly, and they revamped, to their credit, to the government's credit, they revamped the evacuation system and a lot of the systems. They did a lot of work to make it work better, but there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems in Afghanistan, and they're complex problems. So, it's almost like Jenga. You take away one block, you might be stable, but you take away another block, things start to get, looser and looser, and eventually you take something away and everything collapses. So I hear what you're saying, and I would say this. I would say we have to recognize the fact, whether we like it or not, that the Taliban at this time is the de facto governing body in Afghanistan, and we are giving them millions of dollars of aid. So we need to make, we need to apply as much diplomatic pressure, as much pressure as possible, in that, even if we hate them, even if we don't agree with them, even if I don't recognize them as the government, they are the de facto controlling interest in the country. We have to have some level of engagement. I think the thing that America needs to recognize is the true face of the enemy is the Taliban. It's not our allies that are here in America that fought for us for 20 years. It's not our cultural interpreters. It's not our soldiers, that were our allies. It's the Taliban, ISIS-K. It's Al Qaeda. It's all the people in Afghanistan that run the country that were, our former enemies. It's not the people that we're bringing over to America to protect them from the Taliban.
Yep.
I think that's the thing that Americans need to recognize, that this process, the people I'm helping through this process, I've been helping him for 3 years. And he was in the process for 6 months before I started helping him. So, these people are in this years long process. It is a complex and very, very multifaceted process, that is very hard for them to understand. And without an American to intercede on their behalf, help them fill out the paperwork, help them understand what the terms mean, you're almost, doomed. If it's just so complex. I know my friend Will Selber, who I know he always says, "Hey, the Afghans need to take a more active role front and center in establishing what the threats are on the ground and to explain to people in America." But I don't think that's true. I think you need Afghans and Americans together, because the Americans need to help the Afghans navigate government. Because, as you know, as a scholar and as a person who's worked inside government, government is very complex. There's a lot of different moving parts and pieces. And I think most Americans don't understand the government. It just functions in the background. They don't really know all these different things we do overseas. And I think that's the challenge, is to teach Americans about this program, about the Afghans that are our enemies and about the Afghans that are our allies. And we need to have more open and honest dialogue about how important it was for us to vet these people, to create a system that was robust and fulsome to protect the security of America. I mean, nothing is 100%, but we are very careful over who we let in. And I think there's been a lot of false reporting for political reasons, more than for reasons of legitimate care. I think there's been a lot of misreporting and misinformation out there about, uh, you know, anyone was allowed on these planes, and the planes are just filled up, and no one knew who was coming, and they just flew them away. And you know, my father worked for defense, and my mother and me, we all worked for defense contractors at one time in our lives. My father and mother spent their careers there. Anybody who knows anything about government knows it is so complicated. There's so many different levels of control, so many levels of, permission. The idea that soldiers were like, "Come on hop in my plane, and I'm going to fly you to America and just let you loose on my streets." It's just absurd. And it insults me and it makes me furious, because I know the people are really suffering there. Like, this political narrative that this person or these people are espousing was more of a political narrative to get their candidate elected and to bludgeon the other candidate, more than it was a legitimate and decent plea for support.
And
I
right
think,
now, and given the fact that you mentioned the people who are in charge are the enemy, the Al Qaeda,
yeah,
ISIS-K, and the Taliban, does it make you afraid that, or you're worried that that we will see the type of attacks that we saw in the 9/11, the first time when the Taliban were in charge? Are you worried that there would be a large scale attacks on the US?
I worry less about large scale attacks than I worry about menacing attacks of, like, terrorism, like, a guy doing some lone wolf activity. I think that this is the thing. I my wife talked to me about this, and I said, the one thing about terrorism is you almost have to be supported by a state, because they're the only ones with enough money and financial resources to get you documented, to ship you to a country, to set you up in housing, and then even after you're there, all of a sudden a bunch of Middle Eastern guys come to a place and start living there together, and they don't leave for work at 8 a.m. All the Americans that live in that neighborhood go, "Where? What is that guy doing? I'm going to work. He's not going to work. He's here. Why is he here?" So it's a lot harder to come in to a country than some people might think. You need support. So I worry more about like car bombs and IEDs and individual acts of terrorism coming to my country, almost like Israel, or in some cases like England, when the IRA would bomb, when some people bomb buses and things like that. I worry more about attacks like that, menacing attacks from lone wolves or small cells, and I'm sure there are people like that would love to do us harm. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of people that hate America. There's a lot of people that would do us harm that we deal with in the world in some way or another. There's a lot of people who do things we don't approve of or appreciate or condone that we have to engage with. And I think in America, we need to recognize things aren't black and white. Afghanistan is all gray area. And we need to do things for humanitarian purposes to make sure that the economy doesn't completely collapse.
Hopefully nothing happens in the States. Hopefully the people, relevant people in charge of the policy and institutions are realizing this and understanding this. And based on the knowledge that I have of some of these people, I understand that they do understand. And they know that
Yeah.
when you let a terrorist organization take charge of a government or a state somewhere in the world, that will make you less safe. That will make you not just at home, but also abroad. We have interest abroad in different countries. The way we saw what happened in October 7 in Israel, a lot of people see that and they look at see what happened in Afghanistan, and then right after what happened in Israel, how the terrorists got emboldened by having the Taliban in charge, that they did this large scale attack, and all of these attacks that we see in Europe and Australia and other places. You can't have a terrorist organization run a state and have the database of everybody and have access and resources, or let them be in their embassies and diplomatic coverage, or allow them to travel around and then be safe. All sorts of things could happen. So hopefully they realize this, and hopefully they will take the necessary measures in place in accordance with their own objectives of being back, trying to go back to Bagram, so that them being back to Bagram wouldn't be through a deal with a terrorist organization. It would be through a deal with the people of Afghanistan, that the people of Afghanistan will be freed, the women of Afghanistan will be freed, and then we will have U.S. and American soldiers in Bagram. That will be a perfect way of doing it. And along this line, it's almost 4 years. Afghans are disappointed with their own leaders, of course, what they have been doing in the past 20 years and their failure of not being able to be unified to take on the Taliban, but also disappointed from the world and how they have been proven ineffective in trying to free the women of Afghanistan. With all the promises that they made of the talks and negotiations, it did not go anywhere. Their previous regime, it did not go anywhere in the last 20 years of the Taliban. They never changed. They only lied to the people, to the international community, but they never changed, and they will never change. That is understanding of the Afghans. So it's Afghans take upon
Yeah.
themselves to free their own country, whether the world is with us or not. We would like the world to be with us. So the people want to free their country. The women want to be free, and they want to do a people's uprising. And they're working on trying to see if we can organize Afghans in all of the provinces and villages and districts so that they can conduct a massive uprising against the Taliban, take the Taliban's weapons, and free the country and establish a people's government. If people of Afghanistan move towards that direction, what do you think is the obligation of countries like the United States and the Western world, who are liberal, democratic countries? Would they stand on the side of the Afghan people in their attempt to reestablish democracy in Afghanistan and get rid of the terrorist organization like the Taliban?
Should they or will they? I mean, they're two different questions. Should they? Yes, they should. Will they? I don't know. I haven't seen evidence that they will. As you talk about this, I mean, I love the idea, but practically speaking, to be successful in an insurgency like this, you need a lot of support. So it's my opinion that you should be doing both things simultaneously. You should be saying, there's a carrot in this hand, there's all these things you need and want from the government to make sure your government doesn't collapse. And then there's a stick in this hand that if you don't do what you say you'll do, we'll be at Bagram to whack you if you need to be whacked. I don't think you're going to be able to go back to Bagram without some level of permission from the Taliban. You're not going to just kind of land there and take it over. You're going to have some kind of an agreement. These international agreements, they are agreements, whether or not the other people live up to them or not. So we need to be more circumspect about the terms of these agreements and our ability to uphold it to make them, the terms of the agreement, stand. If you have a contract, I mean, if I think about my business career, if I made a contract that I knew I couldn't make stand on its terms and conditions, I would be laughed out of the room the next time I tried to make a contract. In fact, I wouldn't be invited to the room the next time I tried to make a contract in private industry. But the idea that you can change government like it's private industry, make it super efficient, it's a lot harder to do than to say. Government is very big, it's very bureaucratic, and it's very complex. And I think the solution that's needed is a solution that includes intelligence people, military people. It includes surveillance. It includes a presence, a physical presence closer to where these things are taking place. And it must include some mechanism of action of enforcement. And if you can't do that, if you can't get them to, you may still have to give this money to the Taliban because it's not in the American interest or the interest of Asia for Afghanistan to collapse and be a completely failed state. There is a necessity to develop, to have these programs that we develop to keep the state from collapsing, to continue. So if we're going to be continuing these programs, some of these programs, and we're going to be continuing to give money and this support to the Taliban, we need to make more strings attached to these things. We can't enter into agreements where all of the mechanisms of action of enforcement are ignored every time there's an infraction or something that's done against the terms of the condition. Are just, there's words applied to them like don't do that, but there's no punishment or there's no enforcement. There's no mechanism to enforce this action. So
Afghan's perspective, Andrew, I think the Afghans are eagerly waiting for the collapse of the Taliban regime. I understand the argument. I hear it. For Afghans, they don't buy it. They don't agree with it. A collapse of the Taliban regime would mean the people of Afghanistan will take over. And then you can.
I think the collapse is going to happen. I honestly, I think it's a lot harder to run a country than to desire to run a country. When all of a sudden you have to pick up the garbage and you have to keep the policing and you have to do all the things the government does, then it's a lot different than this theoretical, academic discussion of a religious edict, like where you're thinking, oh, I'm going to bring the world back to a time, 1,000 years ago when, the Muslims controlled this whole region and we're going to have a second caliphate. When you have people with that mindset, you can't deal with them, with the political conditions as they are. Pakistan saw us leave after the first insurgency, right after the Northern Alliance, was successful. After we succeeded, we left. So Pakistan saw us leave, and now they say, well, we're going to do whatever is in our interest as a country, Pakistan. So if we feel like these people are going to help us more than those people, we're going to help these people. So the amount of money and aid we give to the world, we need to start to, we need to start to attach strings to this money. We give money and aid to Pakistan, and cooperate with Pakistan to the tunes of millions and millions of dollars, right? If we're going to give them this money and we're going to ask them for certain things, when they don't provide it or they have these major lapses, we need to make more of a point to stop the presses and say, this just happened and it's unacceptable. And we want an answer on globally. Like the reason that this wasn't happening during during the presidential election, the incumbent power didn't want to, raise any red flags about the war's failures. And the incoming party, they just wanted to hear about, they wanted to beat the drum of the incumbent parties doing a bad job. But the people who suffer in this equation are the Afghans. They're the ones that are left behind. Because for the Afghans, it's not a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And, for me, if I say I'm against human trafficking, I have to be willing to accept the fact that human trafficking is a real danger in Afghanistan. So if I say, well, I'm against human trafficking, I'm not only against little blonde girls from, New Jersey being trafficked, I'm against any little girls anywhere in the world being trafficked. And I think we need to stop looking at the world through this prism of politics and geography and start to look at the world as, what we're doing right and wrong. You know, these people fought for us against terrorism for 20 years, the Afghan people. They put out the effort. They did what they said they were going to do to the best of their ability. And a lot of the things that went wrong because they weren't capable at that time of doing it, or there was corruption. And I hear that a lot about corruption. And I agree, there was a lot of corruption, but there's a counterparty to every corruption, right? So if we're complaining the government is stealing millions of dollars of money we're providing from the taxpayers, we were providing the money. So if we didn't have a policing action on recovering that money after it was stolen, shame on us. So it's not the Democrats' fault because Biden blew their, retrograde withdrawal. It's not the Republicans' fault because Doha was flawed. It's everybody's fault. We all made mistakes. The Afghans made a lot of mistakes. The Americans made a lot of mistakes. The government made mistakes. USAID made mistakes. But, we have to stop focusing on who's to blame and start focusing on how to stop making these mistakes, or if we've made these mistakes, how to abrogate and how to retrench ourselves and get ourselves into a position where we can overcome these obstacles and get ahead. You know, with regard to, I have reluctantly, always kind of stayed on the side of diplomacy rather than resistance, because I think it's impossible for one person to do both, right? If I am espousing armed resistance and an insurgency, I can't go back and espouse a diplomatic solution, right? So I'm one of the ones, one of the
I
people
agree.
that
I,
is
I fully
for
agree.
diplomacy.
I fully agree with you. I mean, we need to understand that there are certain elements, certain groups, certain parties that diplomacy is not going to work. You can't use diplomacy
Yeah,
to negotiate with murderers, with rapists, with pedophiles. These are the people that you need to arrest and put behind bars. With drug traffickers,
yeah.
how are you going to negotiate with drug traffickers to produce less drugs, to produce them there and here, or how? Or what type of drugs they should produce. There's no way. You need to arrest them. You need to put them behind bars. Or terrorists. What type of negotiation are you going to do? To not use IED and use suicide bombers, or use suicide vest versus this type of suicide vest? I mean, and I understand people might be inclined to. I'm a diplomacy expert. That's my field.
Yeah.
And people would be clinging into it to see if we can solve the whole world's problem through that means. But there are other means available that you need to utilize. And the justice system teaches us that humanity and the human civilization does not continue without you having a prison for bad people. There will always be some elements who are bad people, and you
Yeah.
need to arrest them and you need to put them in behind bars. And Taliban are such people They should have never been allowed to be freed from the prisons. The five
Oh,
Taliban leaders that we released for one soldier, they should have never been
5,000
allowed.
Taliban. You know,
Yeah, or
this is this
5,000.
this is the thing that would make me
Yeah,
go crazy
yeah.
when people would say, look at that plane where people are running alongside. Biden did such a lousy job. How dare he, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking to myself, Doha released 5,000 terrorists from jail. And you want to talk about that? Like, I mean, you don't have any, there's no moral high ground for any. This is the thing I want to say. There is not moral high ground for an American to stand on anymore. You need to reestablish the moral high ground by doing the right thing. You know, we have done so many things wrong that we keep on trying to find somebody else to blame. We need to stop trying to find someone to blame, and we need to start trying to find people who are effective at solving problems.
Well, as an Afghan,
And
I blame the Afghan leadership primarily for
me too.
their corruption, for their ineffectiveness. At the end of the day, it was their country, it was our country. We should have held, we should have utilized the resources that were provided to us by the international community on top of the United States to maintain the new system that we had created. It was a very challenging environment. Of course, how would you support and empower a young democracy in a neighborhood where all of them are authoritarian regimes and all of them support the Taliban?
Yeah.
It was a very difficult environment, but we could have done it if we would have stayed to the point. Anyways, what's done is done. So looking
Yeah.
into the future, Andrew, there's a lot that I can talk to you about the neighboring countries and others, but maybe we'll do a separate episode to stay focused on the regional dynamics and how that shaped the US and the region, the fate of the Afghans. But before we wrap up the interview, maybe if you have any parting thoughts to Americans, any messages to the Americans, any message to the new leadership on their responsibility towards Afghans, towards Afghan allies, and particularly more than 20 million women and girls who are right now basically imprisoned in Afghanistan.
Yeah. I mean, if I had one message, one kind of countervailing, overwhelming, kind of overarching message, it would be that regardless of what was done by Afghans, we as a country, as a nation, and as a people made a promise. We made a promise that if you did certain things as people, we as people would do certain things. It's my considered opinion that this is a contract. And it's a contract not in the sense that it's an agreement, it's a contract, it's a covenant between two people. And there is no more central core value of an American soldier than not leaving your comrades behind on the battlefield. When we left, the way we left a lot of things undone, and it's up to us to finish, to close the loop on the administration of this program. If you're not going to support it financially in terms of, enduring mission here in America, fine. That's the prerogative of the United States president, and there's nothing I can say or do to change that. But if that's in fact the case, have the common decency to run through this process to decide who is able to get this visa and grant them the visa. And if they can come over here, then they can come over here. If they can pass the interviews, they can pass the interviews. It's I don't understand how we can just stop a program, stop a contract when the other counterparty in this contract has already met the terms, right? You are our allied partner in the global war against terrorism. You have lost, in essence, your entire army to this fight. There's 70,000 recorded Afghan army soldiers that died in the fight, and the whole Afghan army was recorded as 80,000 men. So when an American thinks about this, I want them to think about that. Imagine our army being decimated down 90% in a war. That's a civil war. For Afghans, this isn't a global war on terror. This is a civil war on terror. So Afghans are killing their own countrymen in their own country in a civil war. When I think about my dad, I think about 4 years of World War II. My friend I'm trying to get out of Afghanistan, he fought 4 World War IIs. He fought for 16 years. If I can't get an exception for this one man, right? He fought for 16 years. He was wounded twice in combat. He was an elite soldier, a commando who drew blood and sacrificed his own blood for this country. If I can't get an exception for that guy, then who can I get an exception for? If we're going to take generals, and we're going to take politicians, and you've said yourself, and I agree, many of which were very corrupt. We had no problem bringing the generals over here. We had no problem bringing the politicians, the cabinet ministers, some of which I'm sure we knew were corrupt. We had no problem with them coming. So if we have a problem with an elite fighting man being liberated from an area of a battlefield that we abandon, and we refuse to go back and get that person and help that person, we do so at our own risk. We do so at great risk because history records our actions. History will remember. When I was going through this, I had an emotional breakdown doing this work. I invested myself entirely in this for years. And I can tell you, my wife confronted me at one point and said, "This is too hard for you to do. You just have to stop doing this." And I said, if I stop doing this, my friend's daughter will be sold into human slavery. His adult sons will be murdered. He will be executed. His daughter will be married to the Taliban. These are the consequences that you learn as you do this work, right? So when you try to walk away, it's very hard because now you're walking away from a person whose only hope for salvation is you. And I don't say that. I say that with a lot of humility, and I don't say that to build myself up as if I'm the salvation of other people. I say that as a matter of fact that you need an American helper in this country to help you to understand what the State Department is doing, because this is such a huge bureaucracy and it's such a complex process. These people need us. We needed them. This is my kind of overall message. When we went to wage war on terrorists across the world, we needed Arabic speakers, Pashto speakers, people to speak the local language, and we needed that cultural interpretation because we didn't know the first darn thing about Afghanistan and its people, about how complex the region was. We had lost every lesson we learned from Charlie Wilson's war. We lost. And I ironically, Charlie Wilson's war was on. I just watched that last night, and in the last scene, Charlie Wilson is said to have said, we did all these miraculous things, we did all these great things, and then we kind of, messed it up in the end because the last thing he asked for was $1 million to build a school in Afghanistan. And the government just laughed him right out of the room. Who cares about a school in Afghanistan? Well, you have the Taliban come in, who's been radicalized by Pakistan and by the Saudi government. They've gone, into all these safe havens, and they went and got, very, very severe religious training that brought them back into the country as lunatics. The Muslims I know are absolutely aghast at the behavior of the Taliban. I have family members that are Muslim, and I have lots of friends that are Muslim, and any good Muslim would tell you, that there's nothing in Islam that says you should drown a person with their hands tied behind their back. You should shoot children in cold blood for no reason. You should rape women. You should torture, There's nothing that supports the things that the Taliban are doing in Islam. Yeah. There's no good Muslim I know that supports this kind of behavior. We just need, as Americans, to be our best selves. we need to apply our fundamental core values, the rule of law, justice, freedom. These are the things that I fought for. These are the things that my father fought for. These are the things that my parents sacrificed their whole life and career for security. But security isn't worth anything if you give away all the things that make your country great. The great part about America is that we're a melting pot of a multicultural nation full of a lot of great ideas from all around the world and a lot of great people from all around the world. And we can't let terrorists like the Taliban or Al Qaeda or ISIS or any of these people take us away from what makes us great, our core values. We need to keep being Americans. And I think if we can do that, if we can keep at it, keep applying our core values, maintain, two tracks of pressure, yep. A carrot and a stick. If you want this money, you need to deliver a result. And if you don't deliver the result, we're going to kill you for it or make you pay for it.
Thank you.
I will reluctantly say as I close that if you show me evidence the United States government is supporting the resistance, I would more than happily, lend my support to the resistance. But until I see really concerted efforts from the United States government to put us back in the fight in terms of insurgency, I won't support it until I know that I'm giving advice that is good advice. Yep. And I think the best advice is to stick to your guns, to have, morals and the core values and the courage. When this was affecting me, it affected me really, really, it was a life and death thing. And, I was seeing people being murdered every day and, friends of ours, some people from the task force were murdered that we were in Afghanistan that were helping us in Afghanistan. And I think about all the sacrifices all these people made, all the soldiers that died, all the soldiers that fought, all the Afghans that died. We have put a lot of effort into this. And, the thing that's more valuable than gold is the blood of our children. The thing that's more valuable than being right is being just. And I think, if it was up to me, every one of the Taliban would be underneath a headstone in the nearest graveyard. I'll be completely honest with you.
Hopefully soon. Keeping fingers crossed. Andrew. Keeping fingers crossed on that. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Great conversation for all those who joined us. It was Andrew J. Walker, a U.S. strategic consultant, emergency responder, a writer, an advocate for Afghans, someone who helped Afghans during the evacuation time, during the U.S. withdrawal. At a time it was difficult for many Afghans. He was one of many Americans who volunteered to help our allies get to safety at a lot of risks and a lot of cost personally to them and their families. We thank you and thank your families for helping you and allowing you to take part in this. And you're still doing it. We appreciate all of the effort, and we continue to looking forward to seeing you more and more being active on these issues as we move forward on two tracks of trying to see if we can save as many Afghans as possible and bring them to America for safety, but also trying to see if we can liberate Afghanistan and make Afghanistan safe for all the people who are going to remain, because we can't bring everybody here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For all the viewers, this was our episode, Real Talks with Amini, with Mr. Andrew J. Walker. Until next time, God bless you, God bless Afghanistan, God bless United States, and God bless our world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it.